Hey, my name is Matthias Carlson, and I'll be presenting our paper on compositional tracking of a Huff-n-Puff project in the Eagleford, a second take on behalf of myself and my co-authors at both Whitson and EP Energy. What's worth emphasizing is that this is actually a follow-up paper from a paper we presented in 2019 at Urtec, where the main difference between this paper and that paper is that in this paper we're presenting results for a gas condensate area of the Eagleford, while last year we were focusing on a black oil area of the Eagleford. So in the paper, there's a lot of interesting information about the differences between the two regions, while in this presentation we'll try to keep it a little bit more high level. We'll try to keep it fairly straightforward in this presentation and focus on four different things. First, we'll just remind everybody why we're actually here today. We'll give everybody a crash course in miscibility, which is a term that's used a lot in relationship with gas injection processes. We'll touch on gas EOR, what's important and why, and then in the end we'll dig into this gas Huff-n-Puff project in the Eagleford. The first question is the simplest, answering why we're actually here today. Well, if possible, what would be ideal is if we could, on a systematic basis, go to every single well that we have in our acreage and in our portfolio and get this type of incremental uplift response from that particular well. And what we see here to the right is actually the comparison of the forecast and the incremental oil production from one of the study wells that we were studying as a part of this project, and where more information is given in the paper itself. In this paper, however, what we'll try to answer is what are the primary mechanisms behind gas Huff-n-Puff uplift seen in actual field performance. So what is actually causing what we saw on the last slide. And the way we'll try to do that is to analyze the compositional signature during the flowback period, the so-called puff period. So we're in a way we're using the field and the field data as a laboratory instead of being in a lab at a university or any commercial laboratory. So over to miscibility and just a crash course on miscibility. So in the oil and gas domain, we typically differentiate between two different types of miscibility. It's the so-called first contact miscibility, which is what's relevant for gas Huff-n-Puff. And then we have multi-contact miscibility, which is relevant for displacement processes. In this presentation, we'll focus on gas Huff-n-Puff and then also first contact miscibility. And luckily for us, that's also the easiest concept to understand, or the simplest process to understand from a intuition standpoint. So the fundamentals related to gas Huff-n-Puff, as many of us know, is that gas Huff-n-Puff is not a displacement process, and that's very key to understand. And that has some implications. Well, the most important implication is that uplift is determined by the degree of mixing of the injection gas and the reservoir fluid. Okay, and if you did this as a Huff-n-Puff PVT experiment in the laboratory, you would essentially only have two ways of recovering additional hydrocarbons, which one would be vaporization when the resulting mixture of this injection gas and reservoir oil is two-phase, while the other would be swelling, where the result of the injection gas and the reservoir oil or fluid would remain single phase. Of the two of them, swelling is what's the most efficient process, and we'll get a little bit more back to that later in the presentation. Very, very key to this process is this concept of first contact miscibility. And it's the exact same process as when you mix carbonated water and orange juice. And it's strictly defined as a process in which two fluids mix in all proportions, such that the resulting mixture remains single phase. The way we measure first contact miscibility is by a so-called swelling experiment in the laboratory. Here we see two different examples of that for a lean and a rich injection gas respectively, and where, as expected, a rich injection gas provides a lower MMP by first contact, which again leads us to the third point, where many times when I go to conferences and forums and whatnot and people talk about miscibility, miscibility is presented as this thing that is almost like a reservoir property that is almost like permeability. So they can say that, yeah, the MMP for that reservoir is 5,000 psi. But it's actually a function of three different parameters, where reservoir temperature and reservoir fluid composition are two of them, and you typically can't change them. However, it's very sensitive to the injection gas composition that you're actually using when you inject, and that's actually something that we as engineers can alter and change and optimize. The last kind of misconception or I guess point I would like to make when it comes to MMP, so minimum miscibility pressures, and its impact on recovery, is that a lot of people tend to think about MMP as a switch. And what I mean by that is, if we inject at the pressure that's 1 psi above the MMP pressure, then magic will happen. We'll have a very economical scheme and we'll make a lot of money. While at 1 psi below the MMP, the opposite will happen. So essentially nothing will happen. But in reality, MMP is actually more of a dimmer, meaning that you can actually be at pressures both 70, 80, and 90% below the MMP and still have a very efficient recovery process. So MMP is an important number to quantify, but it's more directional than necessarily to be interpreted as like a very important absolute metric for success. So good, so now we've learned a few things about miscibility. So miscibility by first contact is what's important for gas Huff-n-Puff. Also, the first contact miscibility is a function of three different parameters: injection gas composition, reservoir fluid composition, and reservoir temperature. And we know that MMP and its impact on recovery is a dimmer. Great, so now we've learned some of the basics, and we want to include this into our next topic, which is gas Huff-n-Puff EOR, what's important and why. And every time we talk about importance of something, we need to define a KPI, so a key performance indicator. And many times we see that recovery factor is one of the KPIs that's reported together with or in relationship with gas injection processes. But what we have to answer is, okay, we get a recovery factor, but at what cost? And that's why me and my colleagues like to use more the so-called EOR efficiency, which has units of stock tank barrels per million, that actually gives you a quantifying measure of uplift per cost. And I'll spend a little bit of time when it comes to that, because the units of EOR efficiency is incremental barrels produced per million scuffs of gas injected. And just to provide some reference cases, success cases in the Eagle Ford typically are between 10 to 50 barrels per million. And the nice thing about that is you can take this very simple metric and this very simple number and you can convert it into dollars. So if we assume a EOR efficiency of 50, an injection rate of 15 million scuffs per day, 10% gas leak-off rate while we're cycling the rest, an oil price of $50 and a gas price of $2.5 per MCF, you can convert this number into dollars and you'll actually see that you buy a dollar for 10 cents. And obviously this is just, you know, a simple metric that we can put down on a piece of paper and do kind of back of the envelope, but it tells you that there's at least potential from a financial perspective when it comes to the scheme. So then the follow-up question is, okay, how can we measure this? And what we saw when we started to look back at, we started to work on gas injection studies back in 2011 in unconventionals, was that there was really no good PVT experiment that can replicate or mimic the characteristics of the gas Huff-n-Puff process. And that those characteristics is injection periods with associated pressure buildup, production periods with associated pressure drawdown, a cyclic nature, and some way of measuring oil recovery versus cycles, or the volume of gas injected, which is this EOR efficiency number. So what we came up with was this hybrid experiment of a so-called constant volume injection experiment and a constant volume depletion experiment that was then done in a cyclic manner, as we see right here. The nice thing about this experiment is that we can then start to map out essentially how this EOR efficiency is changing with cycles, and also for different pressure cycling intervals. And as we see on the plot on the slide here, we have three different cases where the pressure cycling interval is the same, but with different different pressures in relationship to saturation pressure and the first contact miscibility pressure. And just for the sake of clarity, higher EOR efficiency is up to the left. Good. So here, like the least efficient process would be if you only remove mass from the PVT cell or volume at pressures below the saturation pressure and the MMP by first contact. Your resulting phase would always be two-phase, and the recovery process would be vaporization driven. On the other side, when you have a process dominated by pure mixing and you're always single phase after your gas has contacted the reservoir fluid, you will have a very, very efficient process where volume is removed by swelling that outcompetes vaporization by far. And the middle case is just a combination of the two extremes, where the first few cycles you're single phase because you're above the saturation pressure, but after a while you'll turn two phase and you get a more vaporization driven process. So above the first contact miscibility pressure, what's really important and essential is this pure mixing process. You have an injection gas, you have a reservoir fluid, they mix and they contact and they remain single phase. Whether they're single phase gas or single phase oil doesn't really matter. They'll be single phase after they've been in contact, and the volume increases, and volume is also removed from that pore space by swelling. And the direct analogy to that process is actually just pure saltwater, freshwater mixing. Let's say we have a cup that has 50% of salt water, and we add 50% of fresh water. We then stir this cup and mix the two fluids and empty half of the cup. The salt concentration would now be 50% of what was there originally, and if we continue to do this, what will happen would be that we have a fluid in that particular cup that's going to be pure fresh water. So you can say that the fluid composition in the cup had converged to become the fluid composition of the injection fluid. And the exact same thing would happen if you injected at pressures above the first contact miscibility pressure, where the composition in the pore space would converge to become after many cycles and volumes, would converge to be the composition of the injection gas. Excellent. So now we know some of the things that is important, and we'll try to bring that into the last discussion, where we're going to look at a gas Huff-n-Puff project in the Eagle Ford. As I mentioned, this is in the gas condensate window of the Eagle Ford. So just a few key project characteristics and I guess a project summary is that the project was started after around 3.5 years of primary depletion. The injection cycles was between 15 to 45 days. The injection rates was between 14 to 16 MCF per day on average. The cumulative injection volumes per cycle was in the order of 200 to 600 million scuffs per cycle. The injection gas composition had around 75% methane and 13% ethane, and the rest would be around 12%. And we had data available from 15 different injection periods, which is substantial. And we can see here a little bit more clearly in terms of a bird's eye view here to the left, and a wine rack view to the right, that there was actually a alternating gas Huff-n-Puff scheme between two project areas, where the one area was injecting into the two wells in red that you see right here, and that you also see right here. And you had a couple of other wells that was subject to cyclic gas injection right here, and they were alternating between these two areas, which is very, very smart from a compressor utilization standpoint. The other wells were only subject to cyclic production, and for the rest of this particular presentation, we'll focus on this on data related to the study well right here, which was one of the injectors. Yeah, so this was area 1 and this was area 2. The first thing is we can just look at the allocated surface rates in terms of oil, gas, and water. The oil rates compared to what was being produced before implementation is substantially higher, almost at max, almost 5 times higher. The same goes for gas rates. They are also highly affected from the gas Huff-n-Puff scheme, as we can see. And the same goes for water, even though not that much affected as the other rates. We also had measured bottom hole pressures and bottom hole temperatures. That was interesting in this study well, because you could actually see clearly from the temperature signals and the pressure signals when this particular well was injecting, and you can also see the great pressure response in terms of maximum bottom hole pressures that was possible to achieve during the scheme, all the way up to 8,000 pounds, which is excellent actually. And you can see also the temperatures, that the temperatures while you were injecting was obviously then lower, while when you were producing they were higher and close to 240 Fahrenheit, which would be close to the reservoir temperature. We have also added a few lines here just to indicate when the offset injector was also injecting. And there was one part here where both of the wells were injecting at the same time. You can also see the large operational differences with time by looking at the separator pressure and temperature and how they change with time. Actually, from the separator pressure perspective, you see values from all the way from 200 psi to maybe 1100. And from a separator temperature perspective, we see values from probably 60 all the way up to 130. So just going through a few of the cycles. The first cycle, they started with injecting into one well while shedding in a few of the offset wells that we see over here, while the rest of the pad was still producing. When the study well was put on production, some of the other wells on that side also was flipped back on production, while the injection in the other area was initiated. And this type of alternation was then continued throughout all the cycles. So what we did from a compositional tracking standpoint was to track the daily well stream compositions every single day, and first of all to see what is actually the signature of those well streams after implementation, as highlighted here. And you can see a very strong increase in terms of C1 content, which is positive and what you would expect from an efficient process. While for the, call it, intermediates, you would have a declining trend. While a very important part where a lot of the value in terms of stock tank barrels is contained is in the heavier components, the C7 plus components, which is a little bit hard to see on this particular plot because of the scale. So that's why we also zoomed into this particular window right here, just to make sure that we get a better look at specifically C7 plus mole percentage. And the question is, okay, why is it important to know how much of the well stream is C7 plus components? Well, that's because C7 plus components is essentially what translates into stock tank sellable oil, which will be where a lot of the incremental barrels will come from. And the most important thing here is to make sure that you're actually producing a well stream that's richer in terms of C7 plus than what you're injecting. And what we saw very clearly was that we were producing a mixture that was, leaner than what was being produced before implementation, but also much richer than the injection gas, which means that you're producing this mixture of reservoir fluid and injection gas, which is very, very encouraging. So based on some of these results from the study, we saw that the production cycle well streams was clearly a combination of injection gas composition and reservoir fluids. So it's a mixture of the two of them. We also saw that very large volumes, I mean, compared to a lot of other pilots, is required to really get sufficient responses from all of these particular schemes. What was very encouraging with the project was to see how rapid and large pressure buildups that was possible to achieve in this particular project. And that's also very, very important for an efficient recovery process, and also probably a lot of the reason why the results are so good compared to the forecasted primary depletion. What's worth mentioning is that these wells had modern completion, such that they have created a lot of complexity down in the reservoir, which is very, very important for the gas to be able to contact as much surface area as possible, and be able to mix with the reservoir fluid that is there through a process that's both diffusion driven and call it convection driven. So that was all I had. I saw probably 3 minutes past the time that I had, but if there's any questions, please let me know. I'll be happy to answer them both over email and through relevant Urtech channels. Thank you so much.